But part of the reason I was exploring this is that, you know, it does mean that maybe you've had an interesting time shaping your career because it hasn't been to pattern.
Yeah, it really hasn't. I mean, I remember when I wrote my first book, The Tower was at Simon & Schuster, and everyone said, you have to write The Tower too. And at the time, I just didn't want to spend, you know, to start a whole series and get on that footing with a character who I dreamed up when I was 19 years old. I mean, in some way, you spend more time with your characters than you do with your family.
Right.
I mean, if you're writing 8-10 hours a day. And I just didn't, I just had a feeling that if I went straight down that path, that it would get harder and harder to try and break from it. And so I made a couple of hard choices early to do, you know, I went from that to almost a Crichton-esque science thriller, to a medical thriller, and then finally settled in more real-world, gritty, hard-boiled, which I think is my more natural balance. But I just did not want to get railroaded into starting a series right away.
Was that your novel that had the prison background, The Tower?
That had the prison background?
Did it have a prison background? Wasn't the Tower, in fact, like Alcatraz or something?
Exactly.
You know,
and there was a psychological profiler. I mean, I can't read it now because there's sections I wrote when I was so young.
Yeah.
Though people are very kind. You know, I still get signings where people say, you know, oh, I love the book, but I don't. It's weird. It's like looking at bad pictures of yourself at the prom, you know, for me, because it's so much of it I wrote when I was younger. But you know, I just remember thinking that and thinking, you know, well, if they want, you know, a sequel, then another sequel, and if that's something that I get used to. And so I really waited till a character hit me in the right way where I wanted to turn that into a series. And in some ways, you know, with Tim Rackley, with The Kill Clause, it's only because the next book fit this character and where I had taken him so well. I mean, for me, there's sort of a point when I feel like I have my mouth around a plot, and it's got the legs to make it as a whole novel. And I got that with the next one. And so I was, at that point, kind of ready to do it.
Uh-huh. And you wrote 4, right?
I wrote 4, yeah, and they're all sort of. It's interesting because they all feature the same character, but in some ways they're almost more like a tetralogy than a series. They don't function similarly. Like none of them are structured the same way, and they're not similarly laid down. But they're all different aspects around the central notion, which I was exploring. You know, vigilante justice.
Right.
And so, you know, on the first sentence of the first book, it's Tim, who's a deputy U.S. Marshal, opening the door to the news that his 7-year-old daughter has been brutally murdered. And it charts his path, and each one is a different angle on his curve of growth and kind of exploration of that issue. I always say it's like an action, to coin an oxymoron, it's like an action meditation on vigilante justice. And so the final one brings it full circle in a way that there's, like for me, there was a sense of closure, but each one had a very specific thing I wanted it to do. And so in that way it was a little bit different, I think, than having a character where, you know, each book is a new case, or, you know, where they're sort of structured in a way that's similar. And I have so much admiration for, there's so many talented writers who've done incredible series where, you know, it's the same character in a similar setup in a different case, but they can make it feel new every single time.
Right.
And for me, I had to do it in some ways a little bit differently, which is look at it in terms of building blocks and how they're fitting together.
Well, of course, to do that, you had to give poor old Tim, you had to torture him. I mean, you had to give him this really...
He's been through the ringer.
Yeah, terrible event. But, you know, I do think there are an awful lot of narrative ideas that have an arc, an overarch.
Right.
Sorry, a long arc into which you can slot X number of books. But when you get to the end of it, it's the end.
Right.
You've said really what you wanted to say about the character, and after that, you either have to find a whole new arc that you can set that character off, meaning that the character has had to complete a journey or a quest or something, you know, and start over. Or you fall into a sort of cookie cutter thing. But you couldn't really do that with Tim. He was not a guy, you know, like a PI with an office where every day that could happen to him.
Well, it's interesting with series because, of course, you also want a character where, you know, there's two kinds of you know, I guess if you split crime fiction, there's people that stories find them, and then there's people where they're in a position that they find stories. So obviously with Harry Bosch, with Elvis Cole, with Angie and Patrick, they're in a position where cases come to them, and it's entirely plausible that they have one after another. You know, or if you're writing cop procedurals. And when you're dealing with a character who's not the same way, you know, like my medical thriller, third one with Do No Harm.
Do No Harm.
You know, it can become very quickly a contrivance where pretty soon you feel like you're in Murder, She Wrote, where you're going, how many dead bodies can this woman trip over, you know, in the course of a series, because you can really quickly you know, you keep trying to have a story impact someone's life who's a civilian who's not necessarily finding them, and it can kind of start to strain credulity. So I think that was another aspect of when I finally chose to do a series. Tim is in a position that cases will intersect with him, high-profile cases. As a deputy U.S. Marshal, he's a fugitive hunter. And so these things sail across his desk and into his office in a way that it makes much more sense than with David Spire, who is a doctor working in an emergency room when, you know, a case came stumbling through the emergency room door screaming, literally in the opening of the book.
Well, I think Do No Harm had one of the truly most horrific opening scenes I've ever read. I think that was the first book you came to see me with.
Yeah.
I think it was the first book we did an event for you at the Poison Pen, and I remember when I read that about, you know, the lie, wasn't
Yeah,
it?
it was
The lie, you know, dissolving this poor person coming into the emergency room, and it was such an incredibly vivid and horrific scene. But I agree with you, it was...
And you still had me to the store, despite that. So.
Well, the writing, I mean, you know, if you're putting yourself into crime fiction, I don't think you can flinch away from the unpleasantness connected with killing people if, you know, if that's part of the whole deal. I read all across the genre.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I'm not even a closet romance reader. I'm an avowed romance reader, and I certainly enjoy classic stuff, but I can read some really hard-boiled.
Yeah, I know.
You know, serial killers are not my favorite, but it isn't that I so much as chew the gore, is that I'm not really interested in psychopathology. My theory is, and it maybe comes from all those years in law, you know, there are a lot of bad people that just need killing, and how they got there doesn't interest me that much, nor am I particularly willing to let them loose on society. I'm not one of those who thinks that you can reform or save one.
Oh yeah, you
I
can't
like
reform
serial
psychopaths.
killers books to end with the serial killer dead on the floor, and you know, people kind of get their lives back. And I really don't like the ones where there's a huge amount of...
It's interesting, my first book's the only one that featured a serial killer of sorts, and even a lander who's the killer is satirizing, like he has seen Silence of the Lambs and he's read all the profiling books, and so there's sort of a, you know, like a modern serial killer element to it. But for me, I think the thing, I've gravitated more and more away from villains and psychopaths to antagonists in the books. And I think for me, one of the things that and I will still love a good serial killer book or project, so don't get me wrong. I think with my own writing, one of the things that is why I've kind of had that movement is because if somebody is crazy, craziness doesn't necessarily hold a lot of like narrative conviction for me, because they can do anything, their motivations aren't understood, and they don't necessarily adhere to the laws of narrative in a way that's as pleasing as when people have, I mean, I think for me one of the big challenges in fiction is trying to find compelling new motives for people to commit crimes, and especially murder. What's a new motive that's not just money, it's not just someone having an affair? You know, and with serial killers, it's kind of tough because it comes gift-wrapped, you know, and a lot of times, but again, you know, Thomas Harris is one of my favorite authors. I mean, I will read anything.
He did something different with Silence of the Lambs, though, you
I mean,
know, and of course then spawned imitation, which is part of the problem there.
Yeah, he was the first of a new kind of clique within that. But you know, it is something with it, when you have a serial killer and they do something psychotic, then you go, well, it's a psychotic serial killer. And so the rules are off a little bit.
And I also think that, as I said, the resolution, what can you do when you catch them?
You kill them.
Well, see, I think that there's kind of a moral responsibility. If you as an author, I just had this happen with a book I was editing, I was thinking about telling you about it. It's very interesting. There were these two kind of stumblebum guys that were perpetrating a bunch of violence. There were two, like, you know, guys from South Chicago that were hired to kind of be the muscle, you know. But as the book went on through a couple of metamorphoses, you're the Latin person here. Okay. One of them kept sort of getting cranked, and he got more and more, he got to be more and more of a psychopath. And when we got to the last draft, I said to the author, you know what? You can't just like have these two guys go off
into the sunset.
Yeah, or go off to jail for 3 or 4 years. I said one of them is truly become one of those bad men that need killing, and it's sort of irresponsible at this point not to take him down at the end of the book. So
you made him, now you got to kill him.
Yeah, but he developed over the course of the book, you know, for other narrative purposes. He got more like that. But then I felt like to just ignore that was, you know, not a sound position for the author.